Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Or good afternoon for some of us.
That's right. That's for us, yes. Okay, so we had talked about previously about starting by orienting ourselves and recapping what we had discussed the week before, but that's now been 2 weeks before, so that's too much to ask to recall and recap. And also we have far more to cover in this discussion than we possibly can. So I think we should just dive right in with a discussion of chapter 9. So Andrew, I know you had a question to orient us and get us started.
I thought a good start would just be with the end of the last chapter, chapter 8. He says that he talks about lamb. He says lamb is not excessively demanding, but there are literatures that are more difficult, more recondite, and especially in experiencing their power, I think he says. And then he ends the chapter by saying, nevertheless, it is the supreme productions which are capable of yielding the supreme pleasures, and which you will yield the supreme pleasures when the passkey to them has been acquired. This passkey is a comprehension of the nature of poetry. So are we, what ideas do we have, having read this and the Hazlitt and the Wordsworth and the Isaiah, about why he thinks poetry, comprehending poetry, is a passkey to really developing advanced literary taste? And do we agree with him? Has he convinced us that poetry is so important as he's saying it is?
So the feeling I got from the chapter is that that for him was more of an assertion than it was something explained or validated, that it does in fact give us these kind of higher order, lofty sensations that lesser literature cannot. So something about it being poetry evokes these more profound emotions. And then he refers us to Hazlitt to explain the nature of poetry. And I did love and relate to, he said of Hazlitt, that any attempt to summarize him would be an echo and a deterioration. So therefore, he won't even try to summarize it. But that means he sort of like passed the buck to Hazlitt to explain the nature of it. And then Hazlitt himself, I described it to you as feeling chaotic. Bennett says it may seem not to hang together, but will leave bright bits of ideas in your mind. So I tried to note what I thought were some of the bright bits from Hazlitt, but I felt like he was counting on Hazlitt to explain how poetry has this power, and just otherwise asserting it and making us read examples to demonstrate it. Heather.
My impression after reading Hazlitt was that, so Bennett makes the distinction between informative and non-informative literature. And I kind of was getting the same distinction in poetry, because if it's not verse, if it's about imagination, as opposed to something that's not imaginative, then isn't that the same distinction? Or is there something else distinguishing poetry from non-poetry versus imaginative literature from informative literature? That's more of a question than a comment, because I don't know, but that was the impression that it left with me.
So you're sort of thinking that prose is the informative kind of literature, and poetry is the formative kind?
Right, because anything, I don't know, anything that has passion and imagination is poetry. So I'm not sure.
But then the specific, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking the way that we were talking about what Bennett is categorizing as literature too, or as, yeah, that we were pretty broad about that too. We were saying it's anything where someone is kind of communicating their love for something. So then wouldn't that all get categorized kind of as poetry too, because, or at least as somewhat poetical, because we're saying that something is categorized as literature if they are communicating their passion for the thing, right? Even the dictionary.
Mm-hmm. But the specific examples that he gives and asks us to read are poetry. I mean, it's Wordsworth, it's Aurora Leigh, which we didn't read, but it was one of the other recommendations. And then, well, I'm blending Hazlitt and Bennett in my mind at this point because he called him in to make the case. I guess I don't know what is he calling poetry?
Well, I'm a little biased because that came into my thesis so much, but my feeling about it is that you can be really broad with the term and then things just are closer or farther from it. And so I think he thinks that writing in verse and with meter is in some way better writing, but that doesn't mean that if you're not doing that, then it's not poetry. It's just about, I think, the structure of it adding to the meaning versus not.
Mm-hmm. But it does seem like he is focused on poetry as we kind of commonly understand it as having verse.
And I think because he thinks that's the best, that's the peak of poetry, and then anything that's not that is falling away from it somewhat. Like I think about the quote about Rostand, or I can't remember where my quotes are from, but the one that says that, it's the Chesterton quote about Rostand, where he says, to the extent that our speech falls away from perfection, we speak not in verse. But if we were speaking perfectly all the time, we'd speak in verse all the time. And it's to the extent that we can't do that he calls it like faltering and imperfect or something. Because he says that at moments when you're feeling true passion, you wish you could speak in verse like Cyrano does or something. But because we're bad at talking, we can't.
So, Heather, were you talking about Bennett's account of poetry or Hazlitt's account of poetry?
Well, the distinction that Hazlitt makes is between poetry and prose, but then I'm wondering if that's the same distinction that Bennett makes between informative and whatever the other thing he calls the other type of literature that he identifies.
He's also, Bennett is in this chapter also warning us against equating poetry with verse. At least I remember that.
I think at some point he says that just because something is in verse doesn't make it poetry.
Sure.
And that's where I'm saying the converse is true also, that just because something isn't in verse doesn't mean it's not poetry. Because like the Isaiah chapter we read that's not, I don't think that's verse technically. It's indented like it is, but it doesn't rhyme, and I don't think it has meter, does it? In the
I didn't.
At least not in the Latins.
When I was studying Hebrew, the teacher was saying that for the Old Testament, poetry doesn't have to do with rhythm as we think of it, but with sort of balanced, kind of a repetition of balanced structures of sentences, and then repeating the same ideas in different words. So that might, whether that counts as poetry, I'm not entirely sure, but that's the way they look at it.
Well, it might be used. Oh, go ahead, Shoshana.
Yeah, I was just going to the Hazlitt where he talked about producing by sympathy a certain modulation of the voice or sounds expressing it. And I think that gets somewhat toward what we're looking for in poetry, that every word counts. And poetry suffers more from translation than prose. Now, of course, a legal contract, every word counts, but you wouldn't usually call that poetry. But nonetheless, that every word counts, and that even reading it aloud is very important as far as appreciating the nature of it. And he mentioned Spencer's First Principles as being close, which utterly astonished me, because I've actually read that, and I would never have thought of it as approaching. Well, let's just say he was a friend of George Eliot, and it's possible he was a model for Casaubon, if that helps. Okay, yeah, he's not what I ordinarily think of as an exciting and dramatic writer. But say, take the Declaration of Independence. When you read that aloud, it's approaching, I think, some of the experience of, but it's obviously it's informative, and it's even something like, you know, it's a declaration, it's factual, and yet I think it's more like poetry than a lot of poetry, you know, bad poetry.
Well, I'm trying from my bright bits from Hazlitt to extract the clearest statement I can of of his account of poetry. And I think these two lines get closest to defining it as he understands it. So first, he's quoting or combining his thoughts with Lord Bacon. And he says, it has something divine in it because it raises the mind and hurries it into sublimity by conforming the shows of things to the desires of the soul, instead of subjecting the soul to external things as reason and history do. So it's something about that, combining the soul with the observations being made of things. Or then there was, it's the high wrought enthusiasm of fancy and feeling, impregnates sensible impressions with the forms of fancy. So it describes the feelings of pleasure or pain by blending them with the strongest movements of passion. So it's this some kind of combining sensory impressions with passions and imagination.
I just have to comment when you quote those are terrible definitions. It's just so vague. Like I get the idea, like I get the emotion he's trying to convey to a degree, but it's that's terrible. Like it's the sort of thing that makes, that just increases the prejudice to poetry.
I did have to work to really to try to understand what he meant. And I felt
I have a sense too, and I read that also, but it is just, you're trying to convince people this is good, who are skeptical,
mm-hmm.
Use something that wouldn't repulse them.
Mm-hmm. But
wait, sorry, what are you saying is wrong with it?
Oh, I just feel it's so vague. It's so like saying, combining it with fancy, pouring in soul. It just, like, if you want to say something like, like the way I'd kind of define poetry in this broad sense is something like uses the full evocative power of language. Including, that's not like the sounds.
Doesn't he say that at the beginning though?
To an extent.
You're talking about Hazlitt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first line of that I thought was a pretty specific definition of poetry, and then later he gets a little more. He's a little more taken by the muse or whatever you want to say, and speaks more passionately and broadly. But I thought what you just said about the modulation of, he says modulation of voice, but using all the whatever sounds and stuff. That sounds a lot like the one he gives.
That first definition is good, it's reasonable. But just those later ones, it's so purple. It's just so overwrought, it feels to me.
But it's not supposed to be the definition anymore, because he gave the definition and now he's just talking about it in these other, I don't know, I'm more forgiving of someone for being kind of general and broad when they've already given a really specific definition and then they're just talking about it in kind of different or more passionate terms, right?
Yeah, I relate to both perspectives because it did feel groping to me. I described it as feeling stream of consciousness, but it was a stream that I wanted to float down and just enjoy and take in. So like it felt not pointed, like he's really clear on what specifically he wants to convey, but at the same, it felt like kind of musing and rhapsodizing, which is can be tough to take in. But
well, I wonder about that for a couple of reasons. One is the beginning that Greta pointed out in giving a clear, fairly clear statement. Then he also lays out a plan in the next paragraph. In treating of poetry, I shall speak first of the subject matter, next to the form of its expression to which it gives birth, and afterwards of its connection with harmony of sound, which I think he did. I think you can find the breaks in it where he does each of those things. And then Bennett's insistence that we go back to it
Mm.
like seemed like about 4 times.
Mm-hmm.
Read
Mm-hmm.
it, let it sit a week, go back and read it again, look at it with examples, now go back and look at parts of it and see how that fits. Makes me think at least he thinks that there's much more of an expressible substance to it than it seems like in the first reading. That's
Mm-hmm.
not that I'm sure I see it, but in parts I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, that sentence I quoted where he says it may seem he didn't say chaotic, whatever I said, but it will leave bright bits. I mean, he also might just be saying, even if it is a bit unformed within those sections, you're still going to come away with really powerful insights.
Yeah.
And
well,
I know
that was what he said on the first reading. It will seem to you not to be that way. That's all you'll get on the first reading. But then he's going to give you you have to read it a week later and then bring it up again when you've got examples in front of you that you've looked at. I think he thinks there's a lot more to it than that. But we just don't get it on the first reading.
That's fair.
And I think part of that too is that so much of arguments about poetry just kind of has to be about experience, where he's saying, it does this, see, it does this. It's hard to convince people from like the principles of whatever poetry is made of that it's going to have this effect on them. It's more that they have to be exposed to it. And then you say something vague and they go, oh yeah, I felt that too. But it's hard to put words to it.
Well, I actually also want to make a contrast then of, I didn't like the Dream Children, but I thought that Bennett did an excellent job of elaborating why he thought it was magical and why that was a great work of literature. He just very clear, like this bit has this, that, and the other effect. Like, good job, Bennett. That's model literary analysis right there. I just find like, well, okay, if you want to convince people that poetry is good, you have to do something like that.
Well, might I suggest that what we do is try to talk about what we did get from Hazlitt, and what, positive points we took away from him, and maybe put aside the issue of, if I did not go back and read it 4 times, so I don't know what the experience would be if I had, but I did. There were many things that I came away with talking about and sharing with friends outside of this group. So for example, I have Mrs. Steele at my school sometimes has apprehensions and reservations about sharing tragic literature in class, and particularly sharing the tragic parts of the literature she loves, especially when she happens to know that one of the students in class has experienced a tragedy themselves, or even a related tragedy to the one that's being presented. And it's something she and I have talked a lot about and grappled with and wondered what's appropriate or not. And we always come back to feeling like literature is a place, I'm reluctant to say safe place because of the associations with safe spaces, but a safe place to grapple with those intense emotions. So I loved the part in Hazlitt about tragic poetry. He made 2 points that I thought were really well articulated and beautiful. Now I have to find them. So that tragic poetry strives to carry on the feeling to the utmost point of sublimity or pathos, and that in doing that, we lose the sense of present suffering in the imaginary exaggeration of it, exhaust the terror or pity by an unlimited indulgence of it, grapple with impossibilities in its desperate impatience of restraint. That was a different way of a different insight than I feel like I've ever encountered before. That it's not, I always thought of tragic poetry as being a corollary, tragedy as being a corollary of intense valuing. And that is what I would usually focus on when I would talk about the value of it. But this idea of kind of immersing yourself in the exaggerated presentation of tragedy having a benefit of its own, I just found really fascinating. And then the second point he makes is that we like what, but that it also, to the extent that it sharpens the edge of calamity and disappointment, it strengthens the desire of good. So that was the point about the contrast with real valuing, that it makes us relish positive values to experience tragic loss of them.
I have a yes and to that.
Oh.
Very much yes. But also when you put words to things, when you make them clear, they're just so much easier to manage. You can actually hold them in your mind and explore them in your mind in a much safer way.
Just the work of conceptualizing it in that powerful form for you.
I was reading something recently, I might have mentioned this last time too, where the person was claiming that if you don't have words for something, it's because you don't understand it as well as someone else does. So every time someone's like, oh, I understand what you're saying, I understand this, but I just can't say it. It's like, well, do you understand it then? And I think that goes along with what you were saying too, where it's like, it's not just that having the words like lets you, you're right, like it lets you explore it more, but you might also say, no, having the words lets you feel it more. Like you actually kind of understand what you're feeling and can feel it more clearly when you have words to put to it.
Molly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sentence near the end where, well, near the end of my edition, which is missing the last 5 pages. So 5 pages plus another page, where one idea gives a tone and color to others, where one feeling melts others into it. There can be no reason why the same principle should not be extended to the sounds by which the voice utters these emotions of the soul and blends syllables and lines into each other. So what I get from that is that a poem is integrating the feelings that the poet is expressing with these concrete images and with the sounds that you hear. And so that integration, putting it all together, gives you the experience of whatever catharsis you're going through in the tragedy, of being one whole thing that connects to other tragedies and other feelings like this and other sounds like this. And so the poem is itself a sort of concept. And that's, I think, kind of what he's getting at with this. The soul plus the natural images equals the poem.
I love that comment so much, and I have to run to get my charger so my computer doesn't die, but I want to I want to talk about that. Be right back.
Should we go someplace else? Or shall we wait?
Coffee break.
We better wait. I wanted to go back to the importance of the imagination and see what we think about that, but
sorry, my dog unplugged the computer. That's the excuse. So one thing I wanted to mention, I've recommended, I think, several times, the Elizabeth Drew book, Poetry, a Guide. Why do I always forget the title? Because it's too long. Poetry, a Guide to Something and Understanding. There it is. Poetry, a modern guide to its understanding and enjoyment. Okay. But one of the phrases that I'll always recall from that book is that the sound must be an echo to the sense. Well, she took that from Hazlitt, and I'm sure credited him when she did. But so Molly, I like the way you captured the sound, the kind of concretization of the abstract feeling in the scene, or the thing being described, and then the emotion, the experience, the personal, soulful part of it that's brought into that, all of that coming together in the form of poetry. And I think that would be a great segue into the brothers, and how that the brothers accomplished that goal. I was thinking about the brothers, Andrew. Andrew and I did a little podcast on Ulysses, and I thought of the brothers in some way as almost the Ulysses, because it was the mariner longing for the joys and comforts of family and home. That's how I thought of it. And it's just, I found it incredibly powerful. And I was so glad that he commanded me to read it, because I can imagine, because it's a lengthy poem, even I can imagine myself picking it up and putting it aside before I'd seen it through. But originally, when I recorded the Bennett book, I also had the responsibility of recording it for Read With Me. So that really made me focus on it. But I thought I was thinking of it in connection with what you said, Molly, because the pleasures and like intense values to be taken from family and home, that kind of abstract idea concretized in this absolutely compellingly laid out scene of a man coming home to find out whether his beloved brother is still living. And then some of the particular phrases within it that were just such beautiful, eloquent expressions themselves to capture that idea. So
I love the suspense of it, that you continually don't know if the brother's still alive, and you go through his hopes about, oh, it sounds like he's not alive. Oh, well, maybe there's a chance.
Yeah. Yeah, even just the opening scene of him dwelling for half an hour around that grave site while he's thought to be just a tourist who's just like idling and has no real purpose there. The suspense of that. And then, yeah, how he kind of delays the revelation of whether the brother's still alive. And then in the course of that, learning his whole backstory and the that he left because of his love for his brother and his family.
You know, Arnold Bennett calls it one of Wordsworth's short narrative poems. And I thought that was, I mean, it's short compared to what the Prelude, but I thought that in fact, what you said before is true, that it looks long on the page before you start reading it, but it doesn't feel as if you're going to take your eyes away from it while it's going on. It's all one burst of literary experience to go through it. So I at first I saw that and thought, I remember that as being longer, but being long. But then when I looked at it, it actually feels short, and I think that's interesting. Maybe that's even something that poetry does, is it manipulates time for us.
It may have even tricked his memory of how long it actually is. Molly actually sent me a text with a quote from the poem this week, right?
Yep, I was on a boat staring down into the green water going, that does look like mountains down there.
But the contrast between the images in Ulysses, if you've read it, Tennyson's Ulysses, of the sea being, this endless, it all about being the horizon, forever seeking the horizon. And then we have the contrasting image of him looking out into the sea and seeing, let's see, where is it? He thus by feverish passion overcome, even with the organs of his bodily eye below him in the bosom of the deep, saw mountains, saw the forms of sheep that grazed on verdant hills, with dwellings among trees and shepherds clad in the same country gray which he himself had worn. So he looks into the sea and sees home, not an endless vista calling him to further adventures.
Okay, so then I'm wondering, one of the things that Hazlitt says right at the beginning is that poetry is the language of imagination and the passions. And he distinguishes it, and later on he distinguishes it from reason, intellect, and will, though he relates them. What in what you were just reading in Brothers would you say that's speaking to our imaginations and passions rather than to the intellect or reason.
Well, it's not a treatise on the value of home and on the value of home and family and brotherly love. It's as if you experienced those attachments in this incredibly evocative and intense way. So it's bringing that feeling out of you, but not via argument or it's kind of having you go through this experience that's directed toward and emphasizes and is emotionally laden with a particular kind of perspective he wants you to take.
But Lisa, I have a question. Is that unique to poetry though? You know, like instead of, so it would be, that would be true for prose also, right? That where it's not a treatise describing in a dry academic way, but so showing rather than telling, that would be true for prose also. I think that a lot of the things I felt that a lot of the things that Hazlitt, characteristics that Hazlitt attributes to poetry apply equally to prose, and those are not, I felt, were not necessarily the distinguishing features, but rather, you know, as Leonard Peacock says, in a simple way, that it's the union of prose and music. That the musicality of the sounds, if you read it aloud, that's like the fundamental sine qua non or the distinctive feature of poetry. That was what I thought.
And Bennett seems to share that perspective too. And with the brothers, it has all of those elements.
Yeah, it's still very difficult to see what he actually what they, either one of them exactly mean by poetry, because Bennett in the second paragraph says that poetry can exist authentically either in prose or in verse. So he's not, the way he's thinking about poetry is not distinct from prose, because often, at least sometimes, you find it in prose, though he says most often you find it in verse. So it's really still kind of unclear. And I mean, Raj, when you were thinking of prose, you were thinking of, you can have novels that have descriptions that really touch your imagination, arouse your passions, but it's not in the sounds of the language don't seem to matter.
Yes. So yeah, even if it doesn't have a meter, or it doesn't have a prescribed pattern of like such and such lines need to rhyme or anything, but still, if the sound is important to conveying the emotion, it seems to be the distinctive feature. When I was reading Hazlitt's essay, I was asking myself, is this unique to poetry? Or is it often, some things are often found in poetry, but are not necessarily distinctive or defining characteristics. They could be found in prose as well. Most of the things he says, describes as being characteristics of poetry are not, I felt, were not unique to poetry, or not necessarily unique to poetry.
I wonder if there is something to this idea of intensity and kind of elevation of the emotions, or sublimity is the word that he uses, that there's something concentrated about a poem. Maybe because the novel is, any novel that I've ever cared about is going to have poetic elements to it, because it has to be artistic, to serve the purpose of art. I think it has to be, but there's something where it's like condensed and concentrated in what I would call poetry. I think, I don't know.
I was going to say somewhat the same thing. I think it's concentration of the poetic elements is what brings it more to the continuum of the poet side rather than the prose side. But it's a blurred line. And I mean, even the brothers, it's not really all poetry. A lot of it, well, none of it rhymes. And then there are parts that get a little narrative more than poetic. And then there are these beautiful little phrases that pop up. So it's not consistently at the same heightened level, but the whole thing is a poem. And then there are prose pieces where little bits of poetry pop up in other works, or poems that have elements of prose. So I think it's sometimes hard to distinguish the two, and it's the concentration level is what makes it so.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of different elements of poetry.
Mm-hmm. Do we think in that first sentence that Hazlitt identifies the key elements of poetry, whether you find it in prose or in verse? It seems like he says it is the natural impression of any object or event, by its vividness exciting an involuntary movement of imagination and passion, and producing by sympathy a certain modulation of the voice or sounds expressing it. So he's got the impression, the movement of involuntary movement of imagination, passion, and then the sounds that are in sympathy with it.
One of the things that Bennett says is about reading contemporary verse, and of course he was not contemporary with us, so it's changed a lot, but you know, one of the things that modern poets have tried to do is to like figure out exactly what is that essential element of poetry. Okay, it's not the rhyme, it's not apparently the meter, although I kind of would argue that it is a little bit the meter, but it's like where does that sympathy reside, or how much can we narrow down that modulation of the voice without you know, an imposed form, or let's say, and in the better modern poetry, you do still get that. You do still get, even if it doesn't have an identifiable form, the one thing that it does get that you say, yes, I just read a poem and not a weirdly formatted sentence, is that sound that gives you an impression. Yeah, so it seems like it needs to have that element somehow.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there must be elements of it that we don't even think to observe because it's just experienced, or it's too close to the surface or something. I'm just trying to think of things like, anytime I read a play with my students, I always talk about how efficient the dialogue has to be in a play, because they have to convey so much about the character and about what's happening quickly, because they have 2 hours on stage to tell the whole story. So plays are concentrated in a certain way that novels don't have to be. So the point of that is just that I know that there are long poems and they're still considered poems, but typically poetry is shorter. And maybe there's something in the more narrow task that it's taking on, focus that it's taking on, or the necessity of being concentrated that makes it poetry, so that every word has to be related and evocative, whereas in a novel it can be more spread out. I don't know.
Well, that's what I'm going to quote the great Jack White, who says that creativity is only really creative if there's boundaries, and part of that is that it forces your hand. And so what you're saying about, because it is short, you're forced to use, and this is how Chesterton puts it, like the full force of language. Whereas in novels, you have more time. And so you just don't have to use all your power all the time to convey the thing.
That's really helpful, because you have more time, and also your goal is different. It does feel like a poem is trying to hit you strongly with the emotional experience in short order. And a novel is drawing out an experience over time.
I wonder
But
if
again,
so similar to what Greta was saying earlier about if you can't put it into words, you don't fully understand it, versus poetry is the ultimate form of understanding, because you can put it you understand it so well, and the nuance so deeply that you can put it in the most concise way. And I was kind of thinking about the path towards understanding. You can think of poetry as trying to just hit somebody with pay attention, versus a novel, you can stretch that out and use more content to help deepen their understanding. But with a poem, it is just an emotional reaction to something. But on the flip side, from the author's perspective, it's such a concentrated form that you have to understand the thing very deeply in order to put it that way.
I was thinking that we need to distinguish between what are common characteristics of an art form and what are defining characteristics of that art form. For example, like Lisa rightly said, that in a good play, the dialogue needs to be efficient. But that does not mean that there cannot be a bad play in which the dialogue is not efficient. It's rambling and wasteful. It's conceivable. That's not the defining characteristic of what a play is. It is a common characteristic of good plays, perhaps. And similarly, there are such things as epic poems running into hundreds of pages. So yes, poems by their nature are it's hard for the poet to write very long poems, but it's not absolutely essential that a poem has to be brief. It's a very common characteristic, of course. I don't know if I'm being clear.
Yeah, it's I want to bring in something Jose's been talking about, but it connects with this. I think the great epics before Don Quixote were almost all in verse. So Homer is 24 books of verse. The Iliad is 24 books of verse. So is the Odyssey. The Aeneid is 12 books of verse. So, and that was sort of expected. All the plays were in verse. I think that the shorter, the tendency to shorter forms is probably a modern thing. Not that it didn't occur also in ancient times, but that also Jose is talking about. Is it for anybody, or was it ever common to sort of talk in verse, or to default that way? At least some people, I think, thought that actually the verse form of expression, at least on formal occasions, was more natural to the ancient world than it is to the modern world, which was also before printing, before literature took the primary form of books, and when it was much more often oral. So I don't know, there's a bunch of random thoughts. So. They probably rap.
Yeah.
I was curious about when he was contrasting paintings and poetry, to make sure if I understood what he was trying to say properly. Just I pulled up the quote. Sorry.
Are we now going to get into the things Hazlitt said that we shook our heads at? Because
I was wondering if Luke Travers was reading this going, this isn't
right. Apparently, if we're on this continued course of incredible industrial progress and comfort, we're going to lose all poetry. That's
He's
one
right.
point.
Go ahead, Joseph.
Oh, I don't know if I don't think I disliked the quote. It just got me interested in thinking. The one that I highlighted was painting gives the object itself, poetry what it implies. And I was thinking about that because you can still have narratives in painting, but it's not really what they're implying, is it? It's the narrative is something concrete, like it is there, versus poetry is a lot about relating something to something else. So there's always subtext in that sort of language. I don't know. I was curious about that because I thought that was a interesting distinction. I don't know if you know.
What you said might be important, is that earlier, where are we? I think I'm on. Oh, it was on page 3. I think it also mentions that on page 2. At page 3 at the top, he says that as the flame bends to flame, it strives to link itself to some other image of kindred beauty or grandeur. And it seems like in several places he repeats that he thinks that it's central to poetry that the natural impression links to some other image. And so there's a connection from one to the other that I wonder if he's thinking painting doesn't do that because it doesn't have the power of metaphor. And as Aristotle in his Poetics also thinks of metaphor as the sort of an essential central aspect of poetry.
So one of the books or works that Bennett recommends at the end is Aurora Leigh, which is a long narrative, or not narrative, it's a long like novel. It's a novel, but in verse. And I'm trying to figure out how any of this would apply to that, because it's not short, it's a story. I don't know if it has, so I've only read excerpts from it. I haven't read the whole thing, but it doesn't seem to have that punch, and it doesn't have metaphor, I don't think. I mean, it's a narrative story. So I don't know. I everything that we pin down, I seem to think of some example of, oh, but this is poetry, but it doesn't have that.
Well, I regret bringing in the thing about short, because I was trying to make a broader point that it just feels like so many of the distinctions are experienced and very hard to conceptualize. And that seems to be what we're struggling with, is conceptualizing what the difference is. And it does seem that, you know, the sound is an echo to the sense is essential to what makes something distinctly poetry, because so what I wanted to connect that with here is that chapter 1 of Bennett's book has a reference to Aurora Leigh. The thing about sit around eating blackberries, you know, as opposed to like experiencing the miracle, you know, we're just going to sit around eating blackberries. That is, I looked it up and was taken from that poem. So when he wanted to make that point, or when he called that point to mind as he was writing this book, what came to mind was that image of sitting around eating blackberries. And that seems like what's essential, is that this concentration of emotional experience comes in part from the versification, or the use of evocative language, or the concentration of all these elements of language into one, means that all of these images are more powerfully infused with the idea than they are if we're talking about a novel or something.
Yeah, so
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, we were just talking about metaphor. So in Brothers, well, I guess I just don't know. I don't think we need to take metaphor maybe as strictly. It's not that they have to be standing for something else kind of in the typical way of a metaphor, I don't think. So in the Brothers, in some way you'd say that is more of a metaphor than if you had a painting about a similar topic or something like that. And so I was just thinking if we could see there how the poem of the Brothers would be more metaphorical than a painting would be. That might help.
Yeah, he doesn't use metaphor. I think Aristotle used metaphor, but the idea that the impression you're getting arouses your imagination, and then you look for some other image, an image not in your immediate impression, but one that can elucidate and develop the impact it's having on you.
Yeah, well, because one thing that's interesting about it, when if you say poetry more stands for something, it's even just the fact that with art you're just looking at it and it's there, whereas with poetry the sounds have to be translated, right? Like art would be universal to all languages, whereas for poetry you're listening and then you're imagining, right? Whereas with art you're not looking and then imagining, you're looking. And that probably uses your imagination some way, but it's not the same as having to do that. At least there's even just that first step of the imagination coming second to the words.
But my feeling reading that was that, well, he just hasn't taken an art appreciation course with Luke Travers. Wait, you don't think what I was saying? Because there is just the reality that like you're not picturing something further after the painting, right?
I beg to differ.
Yeah, I don't think of it that way.
Yeah, let's hear from the artist in the room.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely don't feel like an expert here, but I would very much, I mean, anyone who's taken Luke's course, I feel like would have some understanding of the painting is one moment, and you can experience that moment in the context of the moment before, the moment after, other moments that are similar. So your imagination is exploding if you're if the painting is one that draws you in and it's one you connect with. That's my experience.
Yeah, I'm not thinking that art doesn't make you think or make you think of other things or anything like that. I mean, I haven't taken his course, but he taught me when I was a baby. But I mean, which is a long time ago, so I might not remember as well. But I guess I was just thinking that there's one step that's different, right? With the poetry, you have to translate random sounds into words, into a picture in your head. Whereas with a painting, you don't. There's at least that first step that doesn't have to happen. You're not translating anything. It's less conventional, right?
Yeah, I think the reason it doesn't strike me as different fundamentally is that is the difference between looking at a painting pre-Luke Travers and post-Luke Travers. So pre-Luke Travers, I was admiring the beauty of the painting and maybe thinking about what the scene is, but not thinking about what does it represent, that everything within it was selected by the artist, and it was selected with the goal, if it's the kind of painting that takes this as its ambition, it was selected with the goal of conveying a certain, experience of the soul, just like the poetry is here. And the active process necessary to do that is a different process, but I didn't see it as inferior in terms of artistic experience or even that unrelated.
Well, he is, just to be fair, he is saying he's taking on the claim that painting must affect the imagination more strongly because it represents the image more distinctly. That's a particular he also says, I don't want to judge between the two. So I think that's the particular claim is that we should look at is, do you think it's right to say, or is it wrong to say that painting does not affect the imagination as strongly and doesn't arouse the passions, I think, as strongly?
Right, but so I have here that he said poetry is more poetical than painting. Painting gives the object itself, poetry what it implies. Painting embodies what a thing contains in itself. Poetry suggests what exists out of it.
Well, one thing I was thinking too is that I think it's at least somewhat, maybe this is not agreed upon, but it seems like music has a particular effect on us that not even painting does, right? So when we're talking about exciting desire and passion, I think music does that more profoundly than just the object itself, right? And painting, there's things you can do to kind of exaggerate parts of the object, but what you're going to be presenting is the object itself. You're not moving the passions directly. Whereas if we think that poetry is somewhat related to music in that even just the sounds excite certain things of your passion or desire, then poetry is more poetical because it has this more direct link to your passion and desire versus art, which has to get to your passion and desire through another route, which is through your eyes, which is how it kind of always is, even in life, right? Does that make sense?
Well, on this, I wanted to just actually sort of connect it with what you said about music. There's, I actually think some people kind of view painting as being more narrative. I mean, narrative is a very important part of many paintings, but I think that just the sheer sensual pleasure of the curves, like the gradation of colors, the structure of it, like just to be able to enjoy vision for vision's sake. That's to me is the primary pleasure of painting, of like it's there, it's so incredibly real, it's luscious. Like you touch velvet and you just feel like yeah, that feeling, and like that's what painting is like for your eyes. So I'm gonna say like yeah, it's much more present than poetry. I actually have to say like this whole discussion to me, just there's something about it that's just very odd about this going back and forth. I don't know what it is. It feels like it's almost like a little bit vague, and like we're trying to like draw distinctions that aren't really that important or vital. I'm not sure. There's something that's
You're
odd
saying
about
that
this discussion.
the distinction between poetry and painting, he's vague about, and maybe isn't that important of a distinction to me.
Yeah, as in it strikes me as when I read, it's almost more like this is very passionate, and I'm sort of giving you a vague impression of what I'm talking about. I'm not really. I'm drawing analogies and metaphors, and like this isn't almost meant to be taken. This is meant to be taken seriously, but not literally. That's a little bit of how I'm feeling about it.
So there's the conversation within Hazlitt, and then there's our conversation right now. And there's, I see one thing might be with Hazlitt that he's addressing his time, and there might be things lost to us because, he was part of like just an incredible time and community of some of the greatest artists who ever were. And I'm sure these were all active considerations that he's addressing. So it might be hard even to just put ourselves in that conversation. But also for our conversation right now, I feel like we are groping because of something about the nature of this chapter and about the Hazlitt. I almost feel like what Bennett wanted us to do is just go away and have a bunch of experiences and maybe not overthink them too much. That's what by the nature of trying to have a conversation about it, that's what we're doing. But he's trying to overcome this, what he sees as an incredible prejudice against poetry, that people are fearful of it, that they will run from it in terror. And he wants us to get over that. And so he's prescribing a method of doing that. So maybe we can just reflect on whether that method worked. I mean, whether that method helped at all. And I don't know if people had prejudices against poetry coming in. I don't know how many people finished all the reading that they were meant to do. But did it feel like reading Hazlitt and reading the brothers helped at all to overcome a prejudice against poetry?
I'll say something. I wasn't predisposed against poetry. There are some poems I do like, but I definitely didn't. I don't think I got what was intended out of the poetry and the reading, just in the sense that, like, after finishing the longer one, the Wordsworth one, I think, the brothers. I mean, I found it. I thought, like, oh, this is. I mean, it was very sad. But I don't feel like my life was enriched by having experienced that. And yeah, I don't know, like there was like some connection that just wasn't there for me. And it actually made me, I was thinking about like this definition of poetry and all of these things. And I went back and started going through Cosmos by Carl Sagan and just thinking, like, that's definitely not in verse, and it's like a visual thing as well, but I think I get some more of that feeling of what you're supposed to get from poetry from something like that. I know it's modern, it's not classic, there's all sorts of problems with that analogy, but anyway, yeah, I just want to mention I didn't quite have that same experience.
I mean, this did not seem like this fast track to poetry appreciation. Read Hazlitt. I mean, Hazlitt is intense and complicated, and maybe he's speaking. Is there a fast
track to poetry appreciation? Is there a royal road to poetry appreciation? Well, or is it just always hard work?
To me, it's one of those things that would not be. It would not be hard work had we all grown up doing it. I mean, that's not true. Even the students at VanDamme Academy who have been studying poetry K through 8 and great poetry and complicated poetry, it would still be work to pick up a new poem. And it's one of those things where the rewards are proportional with the work. It's always going to be work because it's concentrated and dense, and every word is carefully chosen, and you have to really dig into. But I think all of us would be much more adept at doing that if we'd been doing it all through school. It wouldn't feel
well. So I listened to this in the Read With Me app, and one thing that's interesting is I got very little out of Isaiah, if anything. But with Brothers, you did a little preface to it. So you described a little bit of what it was going to be about, which oriented me. And I was able to enjoy it so much just because of that. And that was the same experience with making poetry part of my life with that courses. You know, if you weren't walking me through that, then it would just be sounds. And I probably wouldn't put the effort to like really try and figure it out on my own. But yeah, so, you know, talking about was his path the easiest way to poetry? Well, reading Hazlitt was very challenging, but even just the short little preface you put to Brothers, I could have not read Hazlitt and still enjoyed Brothers a lot, I think, just because you did some of the work to untangle it up front. So
let's see, a couple of things. One is I never had any taste for modern poetry until I had a friend read me his own modern poems. And as I was listening to him do it, then it's like, oh, okay, I see the emotion that's being conveyed now in a way I just can't get it off the page. A lot of times it's very difficult to get off the page. He said, read Brothers out loud. And that's what I always recommend to students. You know, you need to read the Iliad. You need to read some of the passages out loud so you can hear it and try to experience it in the fullness. The second thing is, I was talking with my daughters this morning at brunch about the subject here what we were going to talk about today, and they were saying, yeah, that poetry is something they shy away from as well. I think partly in their expression because it's vague and mysterious. And it doesn't, you kind of have to give yourself over to the poet and trust the poet enough to say, I want to allow him to evoke images and passions in me that I would not necessarily want to have evoked. I have to trust them and then kind of believe that the vagueness and the mysteriousness of it is worthwhile. And I think they have never really been convinced of that for the most part in their experience of poetry.
That reminds me of this quote where he says, it may not feel pleasant or diverting, but rather disturbing. To disturb the spirit is one of the greatest aims of art. And a disturbance of spirit is one of the finest pleasures that a highly organized man can enjoy.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
That's an intriguing statement.
I wasn't sure about that one. Molly?
I have to like fervently agree with that. I loved it when he said that. Because there's a number of books that where I came away from it was just a feeling of, oh my God, you can feel that way about life? Like I was not sensitive to that in any way. Like Zola's Germinal or Kafka or All Quiet on the Western Front, like those are books that for me were just like, whoa, that's not how I feel about things, but I get it. Fantastic, good job.
Yeah. Molly?
Is that what
Andrew,
you meant?
I have a follow-up question on Andrew's point about the poet the poet friend that read things aloud to you. Did your new understanding after that experience translate to other poets and other modern poetry?
Yeah,
and how did that work?
Yeah, I couldn't stand The Wasteland when I first read it, and second time I read it, and third time.
But what do you think was what helped you understand those poems if you didn't ever hear them read their poems aloud and
because
you
then
didn't know those people?
Yeah.
Like what shifted for you?
Well, I think partly then I could imagine and actually read it myself. I could read The Wasteland, I think, in the much more like the way that Eliot would have wanted me to. I think also that the fragmented character of that kind of poetry that always bothered me. It didn't disturb me. It kind of angered me. I could feel its emotional impact as it unfolded as he was reading it to me, in a way that I just I hadn't ever heard before. So it was really in the hearing of it that was both the character of the poetry and then the ability to hear and replicate other poets like that. I hadn't been able to do that before.
So how can we recreate that experience that you had? Is my question. Should we go seek out a friend who writes poetry, or what can we do to open ourselves up to that whole genre? Because I admit I'm in the same boat as you used to be.
Some of Lisa's stuff that what was I was listening to Tennyson's In Memoriam HHH. That's the way Lisa reads it is just fantastic. And so it doesn't have to be somebody who's written it, but somebody who loves it, and somebody who would say, who'd be excited. Oh, there's going to be somebody who wants to listen to me read poetry for 20 minutes. That's the person. Whatever they want to read, let them do it. And
okay, that's great. Thank you.
One thing I was thinking about the mystery thing is there's another quote that someone, I can't remember who it was, but they said that the poet clarifies not by way of the metaphysician, but makes use of mystery as an unknown force. And I thought that was just relevant to what we were saying, where you kind of have to give yourself over and admit that it's mysterious, but they have this power over you. And also, I think Joseph would appreciate Isaiah more if you gotta hear it chanted. That's the equivalent of hearing it recited. Like, learn Latin and then listen to the chant, and then it's beautiful. Yeah. It'll hit you.
On the point of
honestly, Joseph, you should try something like that. There's got to be something online where you can do that. I wonder.
I'm surprised Lisa didn't chant it in the recording.
Very different.
I did my best, man. That was a tall order for me to read the Bible. Yeah.
On the point,
I did listen to it on.
On the point of hearing it out loud, like Bernard Shaw has a quote where he said in like one of his prefaces where he says that the problems of reading a play versus seeing it is there's 50 ways of saying the word yes. There's 100 ways of saying no, but there's only one way to write it down. And I just want to say about it's happened to me where I've listened to an audiobook after having read it, and it's like, oh, that's how you're supposed to say. That was meant to be funny. Like that's happening numberless times. And actually, there's even like one or two books I can think of where like I was like, whatever, and then I try to listen to it, like, oh, this is ecstatic. So Audible's always a good source.
That's true, so true for Shakespeare. That Shakespeare is meant to be performed. He's meant to be heard and seen. To read it just flat on the page is, it's very difficult to experience the full power of it without doing that. So let me just try this. I'm going to try this. Here we go. Ready? From Isaiah. A voice says, cry. And I said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people is grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Is that any better?
It's interesting that you chose. Did you choose that because you at random, or because that's one of the most memorable and powerful passages to you?
A little both. It was the first of the very memorable ones. All of them, a lot of these are memorable because they're part of hymns. They are hymns. They're the lyrics of hymns that I really love.
But that's just, if you had asked me to, share something from Isaiah, that would be one of the sections that I would have. I wanted to mention, I have a couple actually of these books, Tennyson's In Memoriam, by people who take it stanza by stanza and explain what is happening or what it means, and also do it in a personal way where they're being kind of personal and evaluative of it. And I just wish this existed for every worthwhile poem there was. It would be a useful aid to poetry appreciation.
Yeah.
So Lisa, can you please tell us the citation? Like, what is the book that you just raised? Like, who's the author? Or...
This one is by H.M. Percival. H.M. Percival, In Memoriam.
Thank you.
I've found some similar ones, but it's interesting that for In Memoriam in particular, there are several that you can find, several not annotated, not just in the sense of explaining, phrases within it, but really explaining it stanza by stanza.
I was just going to comment on Isaiah that the verses that I think really sing are the ones where basically he's speaking directly. I think that's why it worked that way. And well, I'm not an orator, but I brought up the Hebrew. I could read you a little of the Hebrew because it's very emphatic. Kol kareva mibar panu derech Adonai yashru ba'aravam mesila le'Eloheinu. And he's got the parallelism, so he sort of says the same thing a little bit differently, but more than once. And I think that's also like poetry because it's English also because it's like a rhyme in that you hear something familiar, but also something that's a variation on it. I think that's why rhyme works for us. And yeah, I think that some of the verses are better than others, but the declaiming is powerful. And I think that's an aspect of Shakespeare also, that when you think of the characters who are doing soliloquies, they're not just speaking to themselves, they're speaking to those groundlings down there a few feet away from them. And sometimes they're, even interacting with them. And that's the way he wrote it. He wrote it for a stage, and he wrote it for the actors to be in view of the stage and for the in view of the audience, and the audience to be in view of each other. I think that the experience of how when you go to a funny movie, it can be funnier when you're seeing it around other people who are laughing. Mm-hmm. Or if you're in a theater and people are laughing when it isn't funny, that's horrible. Okay, because there's a disconnect. But I think Shakespeare wrote not primarily for, if you don't have a stage and you don't have other people watching it, then you've just got the book and you have to imagine it. But it's a dramatic experience. I mean, it's to turn it into, I don't know, a statement is kind of like taking your food and mushing it up in the blender and trying to eat it. Doesn't taste good. Just saying. I mean, it's still nutritious, but it doesn't taste the way it's supposed to.
Well, I'd like to come back to the original proposition here is that verse is the highest form of literature and one we need and ought not to miss out on. So did we get to a point of understanding that at all? It seems like part of this concentration and the use of all of the elements of language and means that we come away at least with moments or phrases that stand for that emotional experience. So there were a few, and what I find is that those will kind of creep back into conversation. Greta said you've lost where all your quotes come from, but it's when you come to those really condensed phrases that they stay in your mind. And there were a few in the Brothers that I think Greta and I ended up talking about. I want to find the one. There was one that I don't want to, it's all in this specific language of it. So I'll just use this one instead for now. It says, they had an uncle. This is where you're finding out why he went off to sea. They had an uncle. He was a thriving man and trafficked on the seas. And but for this same uncle, to this hour, Leonard had never handled rope or shroud. For the boy loved the life which we lead here. And though a very stripling, 12 years old, his soul was knit to this, his native soil. And his soul was knit to this, his native soil. That's one of those incredibly musical phrases that I could imagine. It's never predictable which ones will work their way permanently into my subconscious, but maybe that would be one of them. Another, I remember.
One of the other ones we were talking about was if he had one, the youth had 20 homes.
Yeah.
I like that one.
That, yeah, that everybody in the community took care of the brother in Leonard's absence. So if he had one, he had 20 homes.
I actually thought that was sad because he didn't have one home. I wanted him to have one home.
Yeah, but
I mean, it's nice that they loved him, but that's not one place to be to like hold your identity. So I found that.
But I also felt like it was emphasizing what Leonard had to leave behind and going off to sea. This was, you know, the nature of that homeland that he left, is that all of them would have taken. And oh gosh, related to that, another of my very favorite parts was about the unmarked grave. That was so beautiful, where it says,
yeah, where it's just everyone knows who everyone is, so they don't need to mark the graves.
They don't need, I wanted to find, oh yeah, it just said they each talked about, they continue to talk about him by their fireside, so they didn't need to mark a grave to commemorate him.
Well, I was just thinking too, maybe it's a little sad, but it's a consolation type of sad, where it's like, okay, maybe that's not what your first choice would have been, but it is consoling that he had 20 homes, right? So maybe you'd prefer to have one, but if not one, then 20 will do, you know. And I was just thinking that kind of fits with the Isaiah that we were reading, that the Isaiah 42, where it's not, you wouldn't call it happy, but you wouldn't call it sad. It's be comforted. It's be consoled. He had 20 homes, not one. So I don't know, but I get what you're saying about it. It's not perfect. It's not what you would have chosen. So maybe
that's the same idea here. I did find it, and I have to read. We have no need of names and epitaphs. We talk about the dead by our firesides, and then for our immortal part, we want no symbol, sir, to tell us that plain tale. The thought of death sits easy on the man who has been born and dies among the mountains. And then how does the poem end? With Leonard going back out to sea without his brother. So it's sad, but it's, if the point is, as I understood it, just emphasizing the home and family that he had to leave behind, that's a very powerful way of doing it. I had some self-absorbed things that I wanted to talk about that are not, they weren't essential to the reading. They weren't central to it, but I just, it was such a pleasure to read. One was that studying the principles of meter and rhyme is the last order of business with poetry. I feel like schools, educators have made poetry completely soulless by making it entirely mechanical. And I actually had a personal experience at school where I had taught my students, you know, between me and the other teachers, over 9 years, how to relish poetry and get, you know, emotional, spiritual, deep satisfaction out of it. And I received a bunch of complaints to the parents that they went off to high school and didn't know, you know, the types of poetry or the, you know, the terminology and definitions. And I went through kind of a, you know, self-reflection at that point. Okay, is that my job now? Do I have to prepare them for high school and focus on that? But and those things are not unimportant. I think they're valuable, but I do think they're secondary. So that it felt very gratifying to have Bennett make that point.
Yeah, I can only think of one example of where the meter, someone explaining to me a technicality about the meter actually improved my experience of the poem. And it's the Edna St. Vincent Millay poem about Euclid. And the first line is, Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare. And it's that the way he makes the iambs, Euclid gets set apart. And so it's Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare. And so the way that the rhythm works, set Euclid alone, and she says it. But that's literally the only time that I've enjoyed someone describing to me the meter of the poem.
It's usually
so one of the reasons to do it is so you can read it well. It's not so that you can analyze and pass a test. It's so, oh, if I understand the meter, then I'll be able to read this the way it's meant to be read. And especially when the reading of it would be different than your ordinary way of saying it.
But if you understand the meaning because you've taken Lisa's class for 9 years, you're much more likely to say Euclid alone and not even be aware that there's a meter.
If you didn't, you'd be
so
correct.
You would just get it. You would just know.
Yeah, the I can think of times that the power, so you experience the power, and then having it explained why it's so powerful is fascinating and delightful to know, but usually after I've experienced the power. So I always loved with the Lady of Shalott. I think it's probably in one of the books I recommended that it was pointed out that it starts out on either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye, and it has this like swaying sound almost like the fields of barley. And then when Lancelot appears, it's a bow shot from her bower eaves. He rode among the barley. I mean, it's like this harsh kind of abrupt sound that comes in. So the idea of the sound being an echo to the sense, well, that's a great abstract statement, but that I love, it's helpful to have those concretizations, but it felt more like outside analysis of where the power comes from, not experience of the power of it. Also, let's see, Shoshana, you just made the point about people laughing when it's not appropriate. And I've complained bitterly about my experience of seeing Cyrano de Bergerac performed. There was one time I took a group of students who had read, relished, loved the play, and we saw it performed. And, the final scene, the leaves are falling because, which is, symbolic and suited to this somber final act. And then a leaf landed on somebody's head, and it was just, dissolved into laughter because that was and my students were disturbed at people laughing, but this was all that was accessible to them, I guess, was that a leaf had fallen on somebody's head. But let's see, I love the line, there is no logical answer to a guffaw. The idea that people who find poetry silly or artificial, that you can't really argue with that because there's no logical answer to a guffaw. But
I do want to disagree with that. I don't think that's like the way you answer that sort of thing is, no, here's really important values and they're being essentialized or presented in this particular kind of way, which has good, straightforward reasons. Like,
you couldn't make that argument to the blackbird from Chanticleer. Like, tried explaining that to him. There
are some people who are bastards. I agree. Like, you can't make arguments with bastards, but you can but there are people who feel like, oh, come on, this poetry stuff. Like, I don't know, my parents, let's say, like they feel like, oh, what is that? Isn't this like silly and fatuous? And it's like, well, no, you can actually give arguments of like, well, how about you read this? And here's how it works. And it makes sense that it happens that way. Like there's points to be made. I think there's an actual intellectual defense.
I don't think he would disagree with that. But Zach, you wanted to say something?
He actually did answer it. He says you have to decide if you're with the angels or the nincompoops.
That's just ad hominem.
Hey, it worked for me.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a nincompoop.
Yeah, because what you have to end up saying to them is the leaf falling on his hat funnier than it is sad what's going on in the situation? Sure. Yeah, and at the bottom of things, like someone might just say, no, it's funnier that the leaf fell, like that. And that's why he's saying it's just a moral question. It's take yourself in hand, figure out if you want to be the kind of person who finds that more funny than you find the other stuff serious, and then act accordingly. But it's, because when Cyrano, they did it at TAC too, and even then people were laughing in the final scene because there's a couple things that you could maybe twist to be thought of as funny. And I was just appalled because it's like, it's not more funny than it is serious. And so, but people are just, I think they're also just uncomfortable. It's just easier to be a nincompoop than an angel. And so people,
I've definitely wanted to shoot the audiences from time to time. So
or they're just not capable of feeling that deeper sadness yet, and that is where their emotions are. It's honest. I mean, it might not be meant as cruel, it might actually be they're not there yet. I would think they would be pitied.
My frustration was not directed at those children in particular. I mean, it is in the moment, but it was at the education that brought them there. So this is another one of those things that I think is a defining element of the VanDamme Academy culture and environment, is that I feel like we are trying to create an environment in which, Bennett's phrase is, there's no surer sign of imperfect development than the impulse to snigger at what is unusual, naive, or exuberant. And the converse of that is central to what the culture we're trying to create at school, where you feel comfortable, because I think, Greta, I agree that part of it is just not learning to be comfortable with reverence, to be comfortable with, just being an open valuer. And we sometimes talk about that explicitly at school. I don't usually moralize to them in this way, but if it comes up, we'll talk about why it is uncomfortable. And one of the things people acknowledge immediately is that it makes you vulnerable to love something. If you love something, somebody else might laugh at it, or somebody else might tear you down. So it's maybe a position of more comfort to hide in the wings and snigger at things. But you have to learn how to just commit yourself to be an angel and not an income.
Because also, like, if you don't laugh during the last scene of Cyrano, you're going to cry. And it is, like, it's more embarrassing to cry. Like, the person I was watching it with, it was one of the first times he's ever cried at any artistic representation at all. And he was sobbing. And it's like, yeah, he's a 22-year-old guy sobbing in front of all these people. And it's like, that's definitely more uncomfortable. So I pity the people, but I also know the people at TAC. I know that they're capable of reverence, and I'd like to see it when it's demanded of them. So, but I get what you're saying. Like more than anything, it's just, well, I'm sorry for you that you can't experience this, but every once in a while, they can, and they're just refusing to.
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you that after my lecture this summer on Hugo and Rostand, I lost count of the number of people who came up to me afterwards and said, I had to stop myself from crying. And my answer just became routine. I'd say, why stop? It's okay. But that is a place of discomfort for a lot of people to experience their emotion in a crowd. Well, it is 12:30. I don't know if there's any last comments.
Well, I just want to say one thing, to a little more sympathy to at least a certain class of sniggerers. Just as an essence, very appropriate adolescent humor, let's say, that was less than reverent. And if somebody had pulled me aside and said, like, hey, in the serious values here, you really shouldn't be laughing at that for XYZ reason. Like, you're not going into like why that's fundamentally inappropriate. That would have actually change through a slower process on my own when I got older. So I just want to make that point of, there's an argument to be had with a certain class of sniggerer.
Yeah, I think he's just saying it's an act of the will. You have to decide to follow those reasons or not. But I think you're right that there are intellectual reasons to not laugh. You just have to see that and then decide.
Well, also, I just want to make the point that he's talking about adults, and he's calling that behavior juvenile. So that it's certainly a developmental thing that kids have to go through. And in my classes, I'm very gentle. I want to preserve reverence for the thing at hand, but there's a lot of latitude and humor allowed within the classroom conversation. So there's an art to directing toward the reverent without squashing the individual expression. Well, I will send out an assignment for our next discussion, and we'll resume again next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.